This segment is about asking all the right questions. This is a 3 master cylinder setup we're putting in, and the primary source of this is Tilton, but the adaptation kit that comes with it is from another source. And the problem is how much work you have to do to make this fit. You have to blow away quite a bit of the steering mechanism on this car to make these things fit. As you can see, you have to blow away quite a bit of the firewall, and I'll have to cut off part of the mounting bracketry for the steering column in order for this thing to fit. I'm not saying that we are Nostradamus or something and we have all the answers, but something like this is a little frustrating. It's frustrating because I'm not a big fan of removing some of the structural areas of the car to make something like this fit. And now I have to remove even more just to make this install clean. So the point I'm trying to make here is, if you're going to buy something like this, ask all the right questions. There are, I could think of at least 4 or 5 different aftermarket companies making something similar to this, and I gotta confess, I have a feeling this is probably my least favorite of all of them. It's labor intensive to make this thing fit. It's not, quite honestly, thought all the way through, because when you remove this much of the metal of the firewall, this is right where your exhaust is at, and this plate doesn't compensate for the air gap you're going to have right here on the firewall. So we have an insulation foam tape on the backside of that billet plate to make sure that it seals up tight. But my point is more so, that's just something we think of because we have to be conscious of the safety factors and things. Is everybody and their brother going to think about that when they're putting this in? I don't know. So my number one objective is always safety, safety, and then safety. We can go fast later, but we need to be safe today. So yeah, I don't think I'm a fan of this. We're going to make it work. It'll look very pro. But if you're looking for some kind of trick brake package, do some homework, shop around before you spend money, because this system isn't cheap, and by having somebody like me put it in, it makes it even more expensive. We have this rule that we have put in place a long time ago. If we're going to up the performance of the car, there is a point in which I am adamant that we need to change out the brake system as well. It's not to raise the overall ticket price or the experience of your car being built. It's a common sense approach. You can't honestly expect a car, like in this case, it's going to have 225, 230 horsepower, to be able to work well with the stock brakes, the solid disc brakes. That's why we switched over to the Alfaholics vented front brake system on this, because you need to be able to dissipate that heat. You go fast, you got to stop fast. That's a common rule. But as far as the brake package, there are many things about this particular Tilton setup I'm not a fan of. It's not something I personally would recommend to my customers, but this particular customer purchased this on his own. It's not the Tilton package itself that I have an issue with. It's the, how much of the actual car you have to blow apart in order for the system to fit. We have put in other Tilton packages that work well. This particular one, it's just a little awkward. This base plate, as cool as it looks, you have to cut out a lot of it to make it fit this particular car. It doesn't exactly fit flush. You have to put an insulation in there so you don't get carbon monoxide poisoning from your exhaust. But the thing of it is what does make sense about this is the setup on this. This is a Tilton package, and each one of these pistons are different sizes based off of what their job is. For example, for the front brakes, we're driving some big brakes. For the front brakes, we have a larger piston in this one. Rear brakes, a smaller piston, and the clutch has its own piston size. The cool thing about that is there's also a control bar on the actual pedal, so you can control the proportioning of the fluid movement or the travel of the pedal to the brakes as well. So there's lots of adjustability in this. I do like that about this particular setup. But the actual takeaway is if you're looking to put a lot of power to your car, you need to think about how you're going to stop that car. Obviously 5-10% above stock, no big deal. Brakes you have are fine. The actual Alfa brakes are a really good brake package, and I know plenty of people who race on those brakes and they do well with them. It's when you start to go way over, you got to think about it. Okay, we're going to play a little bit with Taboo. Talking about headers, whether you go with an upgraded modern header or stick with the original cast iron one or whatever. This is probably one of the most volatile conversations I think I've ever seen happen on general discussion boards and at the racetrack. And the one thing about it is it's kind of like a Wikipedia thing. Everybody's got a little bit of information that's probably very much correct. Some people got information that's completely incorrect, and there's some people who are spot on with just about everything that they're saying. So I'm always kind of amused in watching how those things develop. If you've watched any of our videos, you've probably seen a few of them where we go to the dyno and we test motors that we've just finished building. Well, when we're there, we always take the opportunity to test either a new design header that we're working on or to see what header is more ideal for the motor that we're building. Not everything that goes to the dyno is a motor that is some monster horsepower. Sometimes it is just a really good spec-built motor that is pretty much well within what the factory specs were, and that's it. And there are some definitive statements I can say, and then there's going to be a lot of vague generalities I will suggest. I say this because no two motors are alike, and there is no one clear answer for what is ideal for your car. But I will say this: if you have a stock 1600, a stock 1750, or a probably very stock 2-liter, you are never ever going to be wrong by running the original cast iron setup. Okay, all these are in this gold finish because we ceramic coat everything, and I'll talk about that in a minute. But again, on the 1600, 1750 2-liter stock setup, you're really best served sticking with this, okay? I can tell you this header assembly produces a wonderful horsepower and torque system specifically for the lower powered motors. But if your motor is built around higher RPM band or a little bit more horsepower, this is kind of like running a marathon with a straw taped over your mouth. It'll get you there, but it's going to be slow, and it's not going to be nearly as effective and or efficient as some of the upgraded systems. But before we get to that, I want to kind of backtrack and talk about other things within the system. Okay, what I have here is a 750, just one of the whole set's here, but a 750 Spider Veloce factory header. And I want you to pay attention to primary length on this, and that this is the #1 cylinder. As you can see, from where it starts to where it ends, this is a single piece of tubing. And as it goes further down the line, it expands and gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Now, everything Alfa ever produced is a tri-wise system. And we'll talk about the difference between tri-wise and 4-into-1s. All right, but anyway, what's interesting is this pipe is noticeably bigger than this pipe. And it's most likely, and I'm not really sure why they did this, because if you take this kind of concept to a header manufacturer today, they're going to look at you like you're from Mars. Nobody understands why in the world you'd want a bigger primary. And the same thing is on the secondary pipes. The primary on the first inlet, which would be #2, is bigger than the primary on #3. But anyway, so that's a stock 750 Veloce header. Notice the size of the piping. This is a 1600 GTA real header that we also got ceramic coated while we're down there. They effectively look almost exactly the same as far as their layouts. Okay, 750 small displacement motor, 1600 slightly larger, but look at the size of the diameter of the primary tubes, and the same thing happens on the GTA that happened on 750s. Number 1 and number 2 are significantly larger than number 3 and number 4 because it's the primary tube on each one of those headers. Now, whether it affects horsepower, I gotta believe it does, but I don't have any hard data to prove it. But as it goes from here to here, it's constantly expanding and getting bigger. What's amazing about this is the wall dimensions of the pipe here and the wall dimensions of the pipe here are really close to the same diameter. So how in the heck they did this, I don't know. It's just continuously expanded. It's a really interesting design. Okay, but the point is all the Alfa headers were all tri-Y systems, okay? And it's an effective and it's a correct system. Which brings me to the next of the evolution of headers. Somewhere in the 70s, early 80s, we started seeing a lot of these. This particular one is an old Schenkel unit. We have cars coming in here all the time that have this very header on it. And you know, it's an obsolete system, okay? It is also effectively a tri-Y. 1, 2, then the third's way down here. Okay, but it's a equal length tube setup, okay, which is a good idea, but there's formulas in place that suggest what should be what. You just don't take any random tube and you run it to a specific length and wire it in and move out. It affects the horsepower and the torque and the relationship and where those things peak at. But the point is when this system came out, it was a very good system. If you had an upped horsepower 2-liter motor, this was the way to go. Then you started seeing another company making one by a company called Sperry. And the Sperry system was, you know, it's a traditional spaghetti system. You know, the pipes going all over the place, but they're also in design on their lengths. You know, that's why it was spaghetti, because they're looking to add length to the primary pipes. But that wasn't exactly an original design. I remember seeing that very same concept on the early Toyotas and Datsun 510 race cars. It was very similar to that. So obviously somebody in the industry had hit something and everybody knew that was the way to go. So you started seeing that spaghetti style tri-Y system back then. We're talking about, you know, mid-80s, all right? So, and then there's people out there who are, their claim to fame is that they're the originator of the spaghetti system. I kind of take issue with that. I don't know that it's any specific person's claim to fame. Quite frankly, I don't really care. It's just, does it work and is it a good system? Okay, so now I'm going to show you something else. On that system we just saw, there are people still producing that same style system, and there's one that Alfaholics makes that looks an awful lot like that, and it's made out of stainless steel, and it has really beautiful stainless steel welds. You can't go wrong with a system like that. There is nothing wrong with, you know, that layout, and it's a very effective and high performing system. And there are other variations that look nothing like it, you know, again, the spaghetti setups that are set up for very different kinds of motors. I would say that if you saw that standard type like we just saw a minute ago, you're looking at something that's probably going to peak perform somewhere in the area of the low 7s, early 7s, late 6,000 RPM range. That's where it's going to be its mass horsepower setup. Okay, that's why Alfaholics has the very same concept on their header, because their motors are built to have its peak load right around that area, somewhere in the early 7,000 RPM range. And it's a very good system, never to be questioned. It's a fantastic system. But then there's this. This is a spaghetti style system, okay? This is half of a Ferrari 355 header. And a 355 motor is exactly half of, or I should say, half of a 355 motor is a 1750. It's effectively the same setup as an Alfa, but it's just that the bore and stroke are different. in relationship to what an Alfa's bore stroke is at 1750. But here's the thing. I'm pretty sure Ferrari's not running around looking for some generic small production number Alfa guy to confirm what kind of header they should be doing for their motors. It's a general formula is my point. Okay, so there's spaghetti setup. The primaries, then it hits to the Y. The primary is a single length, then it hits to the Y. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But if you notice, all the primaries are exactly the same length before they hit the Y. This is a stainless steel system. Ferrari did have a small problem with this. These are notorious for cracking. It's a beautiful system, stainless steel welds, but they are notorious for cracking. This is why. Under no circumstances is it ever logical to wrap your headers. Never do that. I've yet to find a justifiable reason. There's always a better way. Wrapping headers or putting heavy-duty heat shields right next to them on a header, we're not talking about cast iron, we're talking about headers, is not a good idea, because if you thermo trap the heat, okay, in other words, when the motor shut off, it takes longer for it to cool down, that actually is starting to fatigue the metal, and inevitably it will crack. Okay, that's why we ceramic coat everything. We ceramic coat it on the inside and outside. No heat really to worry about. Our headers, for example, and I'll show you a Darson header in a minute. The Darson header radiant temperature is about 200 degrees less than if it were not coated. Okay, and its cool down process is significantly improved over a non-coated system. And it's not going to have the same kind of heat fatigue and cracking issues that a non-coated system will have. Okay, so that's just something to know. I mean, if you're in the aftermarket header purchasing, think about that. No matter what the header is, and most headers out there, you can't go wrong. They're all very effective for what they do. You should certainly think about getting it ceramic coated. Now later on, a couple episodes from now, we're going to go to my manufacturer that's making them, and we're going to see how that's done. And then we're going to go to the ceramic coaters, and you're going to see how that process is done. And then Brad from the ceramic coating company is going to explain the process and the values of it. This is about one of the few ways you can actually temperature reduce your headers and not overheat the engine bay or make your floorboard excessively hot or get the brake lines a little too warm. You know, so when that happens, pay attention to that. That's a good system. And then there's the Darson header. The Darson header is quite a bit different than a lot of things you might think of. We have two different types, actually three. We have three different types. We have this system, which this is set up for a high performance 1600, high performance 1750, and a moderate, mild performing 2 liter. Okay, and what distinguishes the difference between that and the upsize from this is the primaries on this are not stepped. Okay, now on our 2 liter and greater performance system, and we've had these used for excessively high powered 1750s, we have a step before it hits the Y. That stepping is there by design from our header manufacturer, and the reason they put that stepping in there is because they did a volume design and they realized that if we allowed it to expand just before it hits the Y, that you actually find more power. In our case, what happens is there's a lot of similar headers out there just like this. The power between all of them is really close to one another, within 2 or 3 horsepower and maybe 3 or 4 foot-pounds of torque. But what's impressive is with that stepping in it, that we found that our horsepower and torque duration is there for a longer period in time than anybody else's. So we're real happy about that. Now the other thing about the Darson header is that it's on a ball and socket system. In other words, this final Y, because it's tri-Y, this final Y hits a ball and socket. The opposing side that you connect to whatever exhaust system you have, the opposing system is the receiver side, and it's set up to where you can put it on there loosely, make sure the rest of your exhaust is hung the way you want it to be, and then you can snug it down. You don't have to worry about it feeding into a tube and being bound right there, putting stress on the welds. The other thing about these, it's very cool, is our header manufacturer puts them on a 3/8 plate. and you welds the inside of them and welds the back side of them, so it's a smooth transitional, receiver in there. And what happens is by this being all smooth and tapered to the inside, it's guiding the gases a little more efficiently. And also, by it being a single piece, this whole thing gets decked. So what happens is this flush mount to your head. If you ever notice that the individual type of connections, there's always one or two that are slightly off alignment, so when you're trying to put it on, you'll find that there's a couple that are just slightly out of alignment. This you don't have to worry about it. It bolts right in. If you have a Berman box, steering box, all you do is drop the center link on the driver's side. This slides right on through, bolts in. If you have a ZF style box, it's a little more complicated. You still have to drop the center link on the driver's side, but the other thing you have to do is you have to unbolt the motor mount from the cross member. You just jack up the motor a little bit, and then it slides right in and pops into place. And the other thing about our header, whether you have our header, stock header, or anybody else's header, we've come out with the very first graphite impregnated steel mesh header gasket. They're copper gaskets, as you may or may not know. What happens is once they heat up, they expand and they hold that new memory. And you probably have seen it plenty of times that most of those copper gaskets are leaking. So what we did is we went and had our own gaskets made. This is graphite impregnated on steel mesh, and once it's bolted in, you're not leaking. It doesn't matter how many times you start the car up and shut it off. Once it's sealed, it's sealed. No gas material is needed. You just merely put it in there and bolt on your header. Well, we're not going to turn this into like a product review or something like that. This is on suspension, and I do consider brakes a part of the suspension. And our customer bought this Tilton package. And I had mentioned before that do your homework, pay attention to what it is you're buying. That way you're not buying something twice. This has taken over a day to install. A lot of cool factors about it, but if I had to come clean and be honest about it, I'm not the biggest fan of it. It took an awful lot of work to make this happen. This base plate, real cool looking, but it doesn't fit in here, so you have to trim away what you need to get it to fit. And I know perfectly doggone well most people don't have a bandsaw in their garage to cut down this 3/8 billet aluminum. Also, the pedals on the inside, and I'll show you what I'm talking about, are real sensitive to placement, and you have to cut off a good portion of the steering column support for the pedals to clear, and you have to cut off a good portion of the steering column bracket support to accommodate all this. My point is this: a Tilton package, there's a couple of different people out there making setups for Alfas. A Tilton package isn't a bad gig, it really isn't. Nice product, it really is. I'm just not a fan of this particular one. I struggled to get this thing to work for this car, and I have every tool you can think of in the shop to make that happen. If you're doing this at home, and the motor's in here, and your interior's in there, you're not doing this. It's an awful lot of work, a lot of cutting. Wiring could not be in the car in order to make this happen. You have to do something like this with the wiring out of the way. It's a cool product. That's its plus. Its negative is it's not as well thought out as I'd like it to have been, and it's not for your everyday guy to try to put in. Yeah, I'm a little frustrated, but this one is for the consumers. I don't know where this thing came from. I don't want to know where it comes from. I just know where it didn't come from, so I feel okay about talking about it. Food for thought, guys. If you're going to put something like this in, make sure you understand completely everything you're going to have to do to make it to fit. Ask questions. Whoever's selling them, ask the questions, because if you don't have an arsenal of tools, this isn't happening. Point blank. Now I'm going to show you the inside of this thing.